Right, good morning everyone and welcome to this special meeting of the Scrutiny Board to examine a call-in which has been submitted regarding the Local Centres programme. Before we actually start on the formal agenda, for the benefit of members but also any members of the public who are watching, I'm going to ask members of the board and other attendees, the officers and councillor Hayden to introduce themselves. So going through the board members alphabetically, Neil Buckley.
Yes, thank you, Chair. Neil Buckley, I represent Old Woodley Ward.
Councillor Cunningham.
Afternoon, everyone. Lou Cunningham from Armley Ward.
Councillor Neil Dawson.
Councillor Neil Dawson, I represent Morley South Ward.
Councillor Arif Hussain.
Yeah, Councillor Arif Hussain, representing Gipton and Hare Hills.
Councillor Lennox.
Hi, Councillor Jess Lennox, representing Crossgates and Winmore, and I'm substituting today.
Thank you. Councillor Renshaw.
Good morning.
You've gone on mute, Karen.
So it's gone back. Sorry. Keeps going back on. Yeah.
Councillor Renshaw.
Councillor Karen Renshaw substituting as well today from ours in Robin Hood.
Councillor Ritchie.
Yeah, Councillor Kevin Ritchie, Bramley and Stanley Ward, and also a sub today.
Councillor Shazad.
Councillor Mohammed Shazad from the Mortel Mewood Ward.
Councillor Taylor.
Good morning, Councillor Jonathan Taylor, Horsforth and Roden Ward.
Councillor Wadsworth.
Good afternoon, Councillor Paul Wadsworth, representing Guys in Roden Ward.
And I'm Councillor Paul Trustwell and I represent Middleton and Belle Isle, and I also chair this Scrutiny Committee. Now turning to our guests, Councillor Robinson.
Morning everybody, Councillor Matthew Robinson from the Harewood Ward.
Councillor Hayden.
Good afternoon everyone. Councillor Helen Hayden, Temple Newson Ward and Executive Member for Climate Change, Transport and Sustainable Development. Thank you for having me here today.
Martin Farrington.
Yeah, thank you. Martin Farrington, I'm the Director of City Development at the Council.
Adam Brannan.
Hi, Adam Brannan, Head of Regeneration at the Council.
And Angela Barnacle.
Morning everybody, Angela Barnacle, Chief Officer for Asset Management and Regeneration in City Development.
Okay, thank you for that. So just going through the first 5 items, first usual items of the agenda. Appeals, there are no appeals. Item 2, exclusion of public, no items to which this applies. Item 3, late items, there are no late items. Item 4, can I invite any board members to declare disclosable pecuniary interest? I'll take silence as being golden. Okay, and then item 5, apologies. As we've already had intimated, we've got apologies from Councillor Maxsood, for whom Councillor Ritchie is substituting, from Councillor Dye, for whom Councillor Lennox is substituting, and from Councillor Goddard, for whom Councillor Renshaw is substituting. And welcome to Councillors Ritchie, Lennox and Renshaw. Thank you for giving up your time at such short notice to join us in this call-in. Okay, agenda item 6, the procedure for calling, and Becky, do you just want to take us through it briefly before we move on to the substantive item?
Thank you, Chair. This call-in meeting is specific to the report considered by the Executive Board on the 10th of February 2021. Issues outside of this decision, including other related decisions, may not be considered as part of the Board's decision regarding the outcome of the call-in. In conclusion, the board may pursue one of 2 courses of actions. Option 1, release the decision for implementation. Option 2, recommend that the decision be reconsidered. If for any reason the board does not agree one of the above courses of action, then option 1 is adopted by default and the decision is released for implementation and may not be called in again. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks very much, Becky. So moving on to agenda item 7. As the papers indicate, at its meeting of the 10th of February, the Executive Board considered the recommendations set out in the report, which it forms part of agenda item 7. And that also includes reference to the call-in, the reasons for the call-in, and a number of other items that are applicable to this discussion. So with that, I will call on Councillor Robinson as the lead signatory to the calling to outline the reasons for the calling and what he would hope to achieve in terms of bringing it to the board. So Matthew, the floor is yours. I'm not going to impose a time limit because I'm sure you're sufficiently disciplined not to overstretch things.
I'll try not waste everybody's time on this, and thank you, Chair, and thank you all board members, especially for convening this item at such short notice. In preparing for this local centres programme calling, I took a chance to have a look back at some of my emails and took a look back at when the local centres programme was first announced, which takes us all the way back to December 2017. Well, the executive board reports going in November, and a review report was taking place in the 21st of March 2018. That date's particularly pertinent as 2 years later, on the 22nd of March 2020, we went into our first lockdown. So we were a world away from COVID when we were first talking about the local centres programmes. And I was first approached about this by officers and through an email, and I saw a huge amount of potential for our local town and village centres all across the city. This was a way of trying to improve business districts outside the city centre. It was absolutely correct that we engaged with businesses through this process, that we sought to make sure that they had buy-in. In many areas we used and worked with our parish councils as well to also leverage public support. And there was a process that was begun to ensure that the local centres programme could be a great success. Now, in that intervening period, there has been a turnover of staff, there has been COVID, there have been other events that have taken place. However, my great concern, and part of the reason for this call in today, is that with many of the programs that were brought forward, we could have delivered them well before COVID was even considered. Local town centres have been particularly badly hit through the COVID crisis. We know that many businesses are struggling. Many of our business districts are struggling and wondering how they will get back on their feet. And the conversations in many wards about the local centres programme were crucial to how they saw reopening and business improvement in the future. This decision on the local centres programme will have a real negative impact on our local economy and a real negative impact for areas outside the city centre. It is across the whole of Leeds that this will be felt. And part of the reason for my calling is the proportionality behind this decision and how effective this will be. We know that part of the council's priority is ensuring that through inclusive growth, that all districts are benefiting and that all districts have the opportunity to succeed, large and small businesses. This decision particularly badly hits them. The fairness of the delivery of the decision, I believe, also particularly badly hits them, as there is inconsistency in where funding has been allocated and where it has not. Some schemes have match funding from the businesses, some schemes do not. There needs to be far more clarity about this through the process. Consultation with members throughout this. In speaking to some members, they've said that they never even knew that the local centres programme was operating in their area or didn't receive any updates. The first they knew about it was when this decision was cut. I have to confess, I was a bit of a nerd and I was involved in the process and I was continually asking officers. But at times it felt very difficult. The officers didn't understand the process, that they weren't bought into every scheme, and there was the leadership from the top perhaps wasn't sure what was happening at the ground and at the grassroots with these different schemes. Similarly, the local centres programme now, with this decision, if it is carried forward, is left adrift. It's going to be hard for so many businesses to comprehend the council saying that it wishes to invest in our local areas and support business, yet at the same time agrees a £2.7 million cut with no understanding, no service level agreement, no decisiveness, no consultation with them throughout this process, and no direction of where the outcomes will go in the future. I spoke with a couple of my parish councils about this and been consulting them ahead of the call-in and what they felt, and if they felt that this would be a useful decision. One of the responses was, at the time of writing this email, which was the 15th of February, we're still waiting on quotes. This goes back to March 2018 when this was first discussed. Second person, the shopkeepers are so disappointed. They've given up asking about updates. The third person, no updates have been received on this programme. What's happening with it? The fourth person, we're seeking to work with the businesses, but this project, we're basing this project on the initial allocation. This undermines the plans that we have and undermines the plans of our businesses. A fifth person, we need clarity on the new rules that are in place. I think that's what's clear here is that the local centres programme has not had the direction to succeed in some of these areas, meaning that they perhaps were not able to advance their schemes to a point where they could receive some of the higher levels of funding. And I look down ahead of this meeting at the allocations. There are some areas that will be particularly hard hit. I think we've got Guiseley Rawdon 30k, Horsforth 30k, Pudsey 30k, Ardsley and Robin Hood 30k, Kirkstall, Hunslet, Roundhay, Farnley, all down at 30k. Local centres that really it's crucial to try and support them. I don't see where there will be other funding available if it's not coming through this local centres programme. And for me, this decision really undermines what we're trying to do as a council and where we wish to see our city improve in an inclusive growth agenda as a city. I think members haven't been consulted through the process. I think it has been very, very difficult to engage for individual members where we are in their own wards. And for me, a reversal of this decision, a review of this decision, looking at how we can actually make it a really successful scheme will be one that benefits all areas of the city, and one that I think we'll look back on and say, actually, it was the right decision and we really helped businesses when they needed the most. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Matt, for that very succinct contribution. Do any board members have any questions of Matthew? Councillor Dawson.
Morning, Matthew. I think in the presentation you've just made, was the issue you were referring to really a communications issue about the programme not being communicated and consultation taking place with members? I mean, or is the issue really a budget issue around, that we've now knocked 2.7 million off the LCP programme? And I mean, obviously at the council meeting, we had the amendment from Councillor Carter, Amendment 16, I believe it was, to bring this back into the budget, which the council ultimately decided not to do. So I'm not clear whether you want to revisit the budget issue or whether you want to go back over the programme and look at what you said at the beginning was it could have been delivered prior to the pandemic. Is that the issue? Are you looking at sort of inefficiency somewhere that's saying, we should have delivered this and we haven't? Or are you looking at reversing the budget decision that we've made? I'm just not clear the angle that you're coming from, Matthew, if you can clarify that.
Yeah, no, thanks, Neil. It's a good question. And I think it's both, to be honest with you, because the schemes, many of them could have been delivered. There is obviously inconsistency. If so many wards were never reaching the expression of interest stage and never advanced at that point, there is a problem there that suggests that the scheme wasn't being delivered at a fair or an equitable rate across the whole of the city to advance different schemes, and what the officers' involvement was in some of those schemes. The timing of the budget wasn't any of my doing. If this decision had been made in November, and bearing in mind the review process first started in November with local centres, and that was when the first executive board report was suggested on it, and the outcome only came out in February. So I'm afraid that wasn't my timing. That was out of my hands. But I would have called it in earlier if that had come out. If the budget amendment had have passed, would it have been an opportunity to drop this call in and look to review it with the board? I think I would have still brought it to the board's attention because of the way that the local centres programme has been run, but I think it would have been an opportunity to galvanise it even further and actually strengthen the local centres programme.
Okay, Neil, do you want to come back?
I mean, thanks for that clarity. I mean, I think one of the issues that maybe we need to look at is actually the timing of the programme. I mean, I think everybody, as someone who represents a district centre on the council, I think we need investment in it. I mean, we're quite fortunate in Morley. Maybe I shouldn't say that we've got the Morley Towns deal and that programme, but I'll stay away from the political contentiousness of that. But anyway, could we be looking at rephasing the entire programme? So, if you like, the 2.7 million, could it come back in future years? We're looking at having a 4 or 5 year programme to deal with this work, which is obviously needed for many of the district centres and will be welcomed. But to me, it could well be an issue of timing now. And I mean, maybe it's a comment from officers and Councillor Hayden, maybe in terms of.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, there is an opportunity to do something like that, and it could be deliverable in the future. I think part of the challenge is that we could have delivered some of this for the schemes in advance, so they could have weathered parts of COVID or the recovery more easily. It feels like a kick in the teeth to them now when this decision comes out. I have to confess, and I won't get into the politics, Neil, my area isn't as fortunate as to be able to get some of the town's fund, and won't be. It doesn't meet the criteria in that sense, but it did meet the criteria for this, and that made it really welcome for many of the businesses, because they saw it as an investment in them, the vote of confidence in them. This decision doesn't do that, and that's why I appealed to the board this morning.
Right, I understand. Thank you, Matthew.
Are there any other questions? Otherwise, I'll go on to, Neil Buckley.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I just wanted to ask a couple of questions, and maybe Matthew can just expand on what he said on 2 or 3 things. I know that he mentioned that officers didn't seem particularly gripped by any urgency on this in the early days. And we had this in Old Woodley, that we quickly identified at least 2 schemes. It could have been possibly 3, but officers didn't seem particularly keen to be quick about progressing it. And I think that's been one of the problems that we certainly found in the early days. But I think where I'd like him to expand is, I jotted down a couple of things, and I know that we're lacking 2 or 3 regular members of the board today who represent certain wards. But if you look at some of the wards which have lost funding, including Roundhay, 120,000 lost, Killingbeck and Seacroft, 125,000 lost, Morley South, 120,000 lost, and Armley, £75,000 taken away. And I know just recently in licensing, we've had applications in Armley in particular for things like off licenses and so on, which we've been very, very keen to dismiss because of the circumstances that surround that kind of ward with the deprivation index and the particular problems and so on. And it just seems to me such a pity that these wards in particular are being deprived of this funding when in different documents we're actually trying to address it in a different way. And I just wonder whether Matthew would like to comment on the particular wards which have lost this funding.
Thank you, Neil. Yeah, I'm in bringing this call in. I didn't want to just think about my own ward. The Harewood ward received 75k in the allocation, which we are grateful for, but it fundamentally alters the schemes that we will be able to deliver and the support that would be there and the improvements to business districts. The hit to other areas, it makes it even harder for some of them, given levels of deprivation and disadvantage. I'm all for seeing more entrepreneurs, more startups in businesses and more business units coming forward and improving high streets across the area. And I think this was the plan that this was always intended to do. If you look back at the initial reports from December 2017, that was the point of the local centres programme. And some of these communities, the most disadvantaged, are going to be really hard hit. And my worry is that the recovery for those areas is going to be even longer too. And the local centres programme, revamped and re-engineered, gives these areas a fighting chance.
Okay, I think I've extended a huge amount of latitude, and I think we are moving away from the principal focus of this calling. We have to say, and we have to accept, that 5 days ago, the council set its overall budget. as a scrutiny board, we don't have the power to reverse the budget. I don't think we even have the power to say to the executive board, please go back and change this part of the budget. We certainly don't. So we have to work, I think, for the purposes of this calling, within the financial envelope, to use the jargon, that is now realistically and practically available to us. So, Matthew, what I'd like to go on to say is, I hope you accept that as the starting point, that as a scrutiny board, we don't have the power to reverse a budget that's been set and agreed by full council. The second is working within the existing amount of money set by the council's budget. How would you want to see the money reallocated? How would you want to see the criteria changed? You've talked about a number of wards losing out. Well, my ward, if you look at the schedule, got £25,000. So we didn't even get the reduced 30,000. And I might say, well, where's our extra 5,000? I'm not saying that because we were able to progress a project using external funding. And obviously you can use this LCP money, this 30,000, to pump prime other sources of money like the housing revenue account, WBI, SIL, wellbeing capital. So I'm trying to get a feel from you, because you seem to be suggesting that this project now has ended. We've set the figure and it's come to a close. And I think that members across the city working in partnership have still got the capacity to use this £30,000 as the basis for moving ahead and bringing in match funding. But I've probably put a lot of questions into there, but I hope you understand the point that I'm making. We really need to look at it within the context of the budget and what we as a scrutiny board might usefully still add to the proposals.
Thanks, Chair. And I would always be more than happy to extend the powers so that you could call in the budget if that was the case. I'd happily have that with the case, Councillor Triswell. But to answer your particular question, I do think that the members will be able to look at how they can use this funding allocation, whatever they've received, to the best of their abilities. They know their areas and they'll seek to extend it, whether that's match funding through other schemes. Many other bits of external funding that are available for some wards will not be available to others. So there is a difficulty for some of them. They will not get to use this to match fund against for other proposals. So that makes life very difficult for some wards. I would want to be seeing certainly far more in terms of SLAs that are coming forward from this, the consultation process and the rollout of the process, so that businesses and members are involved throughout. I think the challenge has been that it has been down to members to chase this up. It has not felt that there's been an impetus or an engine behind it to move this forward. Officers and others may disagree, and they'll have their opportunity to speak in shortly, I'm sure. But similarly, I think we would want to make sure that the LCP programme is delivering and it's delivering on its outcomes. At the moment, it's difficult to ascertain from the documents if what has been funded is a success and has made improvements, and there is learnings that could be taken for other areas from that. It sort of sits adrift and bobs along, and the assumption is that when the funding's used, it's used well. Well, I would want to see far more feedback on that. If there's something great that's gone on in Middleton, I would want to know how I can learn from it in Harewood and how we can help improve it in Harewood and share best practice. That isn't in here. And similarly, I think the businesses have felt a little lost through this process too, that some are being asked to contribute 20% of the costs. Then it was, well, it might be 10%. In other areas, it's been nothing. So I think it's difficult for the businesses to comprehend too. There is a rethink that's required here.
Okay, thanks for that. My apologies to Councillor Ritchie, because normally the virtual hand comes up on screen and it didn't do. So, Councillor Ritchie, I think you've got a question.
I have, thank you, Chair, and thanks, Councillor Cunningham, for pointing out my virtual hand. Yeah, just a couple of things based on what you said, Councillor Robinson. You talked about your concerns about the proportionality of the schemes. I just wondered if, having looked at the report, you accept that actually in terms of proportionality, all wards have been considered and all are getting some money. And I think that shows that has been looked at. In fact, some wards aren't getting any of the LCP money, but they're getting money from such as the housing revenue account, where shops are council owned and what have you. So they might argue that they're losing out and using an entirely different funding source for their schemes. In terms of notifying members, and we missed out in my ward as well on the first phase, but do you accept that it is down to members when they get an email, as we did from the exec member and the officers about the programme, that it's our responsibility to put in those bids, but also recognise the fact that it was always going to have to be phased because we just haven't got the resources to deliver, say, 33 schemes in sort of the first wave. So I think we've got to recognise that. The other point I'd ask you about is during the budget meeting, there were lots of amendments and lots of criticism from your group leader about the capital expenditure that the council's undertaken. So I just wondered if you recognise that this is part of that medium-term financial planning to readdress and reassess the capital programme, and it's important part of that budget process. And then you mentioned Curtis only getting 30,000. We read the report, they've already had a scheme delivered, which was an impressive 190,000. So just correct you on that, I think. And that's it. Thank you.
Matthew.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, yes, so my apologies. The 190k, I don't think all of it came from the local centres programme, but I apologise if I'd alluded to it all coming from that. So I just want to clarify that for Councillor Ritchie. He's quite correct. He also mentions about the parity of the scheme. I will agree, all wards are getting some money. The HRA situation is one that the officers will have to answer. We've tried to use HRA funding in our ward for various schemes and received knockbacks continually. And I know other wards have. If there are better ways to use the HRA and other areas of leveraging that cash to advance schemes, then that would be welcome. But I don't think that we have any properties in our ward, I can't speak for other wards, that are HRA owned or businesses that were units that would be HRA owned. From the members' side of things, yes, members should be driving this forward. I'm happy to put forward the email exchanges that have been had over a nearly 4-year period with officers about this, seeking updates where we are with things and chasing this. The bids went in from various schemes, or the officers fed back and tweaked things. I think that some of our communities may feel that they were more advanced than what the officers were reporting. Similarly, the phased approach, I know some of the areas of our wards wish to use suppliers outside of the council, and were advised to use internal to the council, and that would have slowed the process up. In fact, it did in some instances. So how we can better use the private sector through this, if that's what Councillor Ritchie suggested, it would be a welcome outcome, definitely.
Evan, would you like to come back?
No, well, I wasn't suggesting that at all, but you've not mentioned your thoughts on the medium-term financial planning and rephasing the capital programme.
Yeah, no, and I can understand the nature of the question. I think that this is something that will offer a return, and that's how capital funding has always been pitched to me by the officers, that you see a return on the investment for this money, and that is the point about bringing this forward, that there should be a return. How Victoria Bradshaw and others have gone about trying to realign the capital programme is welcome, and something that I think is probably long overdue in that sense. But I think the capital programme falls outside of the issues around this decision, as was suggested by Becky at the beginning.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Could I just ask a further question by way of clarification? Are you suggesting that at this point the programme should be paused and reevaluated using other criteria? And if there are other criteria, what specifically would those criteria be? And clearly, if we were to pause this and to reallocate some of the resources, there would be winners and losers, and no doubt further subject for calling. So I'm just wanting to clarify precisely what you're wanting from us? Is it just purely now a question of process and involvement and discussion with members, or is it more than that?
Thanks, Chair. I think there's a conversation around process and how this is driven forward by a partnership between officers and members and consistency across the whole of the city, and how other funding can be leveraged in as well. Officers will be aware of other funding pots that may be available to members that could help and benefit this scheme. In terms of actually pausing, if a short pause was needed to make sure that the scheme was delivered and delivered on its key outcomes, I don't think that would be amiss. But if this is a pause that lasts from the nearly 4 years from when this was first started, then that would be a problem. I think many businesses now require the certainty and clarity of what this scheme is supposed to do, and something drafted, clear, concise that can go to businesses, to members and others would be very welcome. And I don't imagine will be too time consuming.
In terms of pausing, I was thinking more of those schemes that have reached quite a progressed stage in their development.
I wouldn't want to pause them. No, these schemes are being delivered, and these schemes are ones that have been promised, and it would be going back and breaking a promise.
But those schemes that have been allocated some money, albeit in your view an inadequate amount of money, and obviously we can have the debate about resources available in the budget, are still able to progress those schemes. And I think hopefully officers and Councillor Hayden have heard what has been said, and obviously we will look to them to answer some of the questions that you've raised when I turn to them. But I think
just on that, Chair, I can't be told that we can't reopen the budget and not debate the adequacy of the funding, and then have I questions about the adequacy of the funding. I'm trying to not stray into that.
Well, I think the problem is, Matthew, we are where we are, and it's where we move forward from this point. And I'm not sure that we would want to pause schemes that are already at a very advanced stage. But yeah, no doubt these points will come out. I can't see anybody else indicating as I scroll up and down. So we'll move on to the next section, and it's my pleasure to welcome Councillor Hayden as a very recently appointed executive board member whose portfolio covers this particular issue. No doubt, Helen, you'll want to say a few words and then turn to officers perhaps to elaborate on the reporting before us, and hopefully to answer some of the issues that have been raised by Councillor Robinson and members in their questioning. So Helen, welcome.
Thank you very much. So I've got the twin of our refuse collectors emptying my bins out the back, and my children are playing. So apologies if there's interference on the line. And thank you. And yes, it's been quite a week for me coming in, and and to have a call in my first week is great. So thank you, Councillor Robinson. So yes, I mean it is a shame that cuts have to be made to any budget, and Councillor Robinson and myself have sat on the Resources and Strategy Scrutiny Board, and when I was chairing Health with yourself, Councillor Trustwell, you know, there's very, very difficult decisions having to be made at this time, and we can't call it back. But we have had over the months, we've all been involved in prolonged discussions about the budget and the need in this time of global crisis to make sacrifices. And unfortunately, all departments and all parts of our community are having to make sacrifices at this time of pandemic. And, you know, as has been stated many times, this is the worst crisis we've faced for 75 years. And unfortunately, some things have to be here. But we are still very committed to the local centres programme. I mean, it hasn't stopped. There is, and I'm not quite sure, I think like you, Chair, where this calling is kind of what we want to, what Councillor Robinson wants and the co-signees want to get out of this, what they want is it a pause where we look at how it was allocated? Because to me, I agree with Councillor Ritchie that it seems quite proportional in the way that the money, and with our money already allocated and the money promised, it will be over £2 million if my maths hasn't let me down. And seeing as though I taught my children maths this morning, I'm hoping it hasn't. So, and also I'd like to make the point that as well as being committed, due to the pandemic, we maybe need to have a look at how this money is delivered and what the schemes going forward will be. Obviously, those ones that are already quite far down the line, we would want to see reach completion. But with us all working from home a lot more, I know I'm using, and this is only anecdotal, I'm using my local centres far more than I did when we were coming into the Civic Hall for a meeting such as this. So, I mean, I've always shopped locally, but I find that because I'm here all the time and not wanting to use my car and make unnecessary journeys, I'm actually using my very local centres much more. So with that kind of like that light on it from the pandemic that's made the way of work and leisure and everything far different than it was when this scheme was first announced in December 2017. We maybe need to look at how we use the money that we do have available, like you say, in that financial envelope, to help businesses recover in this, post-COVID world that we're hopefully going to enjoy very soon. So I'll pass on to Martin and Angela and other officers with that. Thank you very much.
Martin, hi. I'm sure you'll have been taking copious notes of the discussions and the questions so far.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I mean, just building on what Councillor Hayden said, I mean, the report is about making reductions in planned expenditure, and I think it's recognised that that's always a difficult decision to take, and when priorities have to be considered against one set of schemes versus another. Perhaps in terms of how we respond, I'll probably cover three areas. One is the background to the report on the 10th of February in terms of the timescale of how it got there. Then look at the service response to the request to review that part of the budget. And then finally, I'll ask Adam Brannan to look at advise on the consultation and some of the specific aspects relating to the scheme. So in terms of the background, I mean, it really started in a decision-making sense on the 24th of September, when a report from the Chief Financial Services Officer came to Executive Board proposing a review of the capital programme and seeking Executive Board's approval to the outcomes of that review. What that review did was it impacted on £131 million of expenditure in the council, including £82 million of schemes that were stopped. And specifically in relation to this scrutiny, the report highlighted that there would be a detailed review of the local centres programme with the prospect of up to £4.6 million being saved from the programme. So I think it's important to recognise at that stage the potential for the whole of the programme to be cut was a potential outcome. As an Executive Board report, that report was eligible for calling. Building on that, the Strategy and Resources Scrutiny Board on the 12th of October, that capital programme report as part of the budget setting process was considered by members of that scrutiny. And again, that report highlighted that there was a substantial review of the local centres programme proposed, again with the potential to save £4.6 million, and Scrutiny Board members were invited to comment on that report and the local centres part being a specific part of it. That led, as members will know, to the budget proposal that retained £1.862 million in the programme and a saving of £2.7 million against the potential of £4.6 million that the Chief Financial Services Officer highlighted. And I suppose that the background to that is a whole series of discussions that I had with finance about trying not to cut the whole of the programme, preserve an element of it as part of the review, and and recognising the benefits and the desire of maintaining some part of that programme if the total budget of the council could afford it. That went to Executive Board on the same day as part of the budget on the 10th of February. And as members have already mentioned, that then went to full council as part of the capital programme on the 24th of February. And as part of that meeting, members considered an amendment to reinstate the local centres programme budget, but a majority of full council voted against that amendment proposal. So that's the background in terms of the decision making of the position. So within the context of the review that we were asked to take as part of the total budget setting process, it was about what rationale and criteria would we use to inform that proposal. As I've said, making savings from a live programme is always going to be difficult, and with the potential for, as you say, Chair, winners and losers. I think in that sense, the criteria that we brought forward aim to provide a structure to guide and inform decision making. And I would always say that those kind of criteria are not an absolute. There's always the possibility to consider the balance of cuts against different criteria, and that would lead to a different mix of winners and losers depending on the criteria and how they're applied. I think members will note that the report on the 10th of February sought to provide an objective assessment, and I can say that the proposals that were brought forward were the recommendations from officers. The existing executive member at the time, whose ward is Ardsley and Robin Hood, secured a minimum allocation of 30,000, and coincidental, although I didn't know it at the time, that the current executive member's ward of Temple Newsome also receives a minimum allocation of 30,000. So at least perhaps there's some consistency there, although it wasn't one that was necessarily foreseen. And so in terms of the criteria, there was the level of development of a scheme and the detail, and that's just recognising, I think, that if some schemes there's a lot of work and they're ready to go, that counts in terms of factors of whether or not they stay on the programme or not. And it's a matter of each individual member to determine the extent to which that is a factor or not. Whether these schemes were in neighbourhood priority areas, and recognising that they are the areas in the city with the highest levels of economic and social deprivation. I think the reason for that being a criteria is well understood. A criteria around match funding and additionality. And I think that's about the ability for the council's investment to have a wider impact and stretch beyond the initial allocation of the local centres programme and bringing that match funding in. And then finally, self-funding, so the ability of schemes to generate funding in their business case being a criteria. So those were the criteria against which it was assessed. And then in bringing the report forward and going back to my comments about this being a very difficult decision, it was clear as that was developed that there was a series of wards that would therefore not receive any money through this programme. And I think it's fair to say that the report could have ended there. What we did was, in discussion with finance and my discussion with the previous executive member, was want to recognise, well, let's try and rescue the programme and seek if within the parameters of the budget we can secure a floor allocation, a minimum allocation of £30,000 for each ward. And that was the basis upon which that proposition came forward. It was to try and, against a background of being asked to deliver £4.6 million of savings potentially, to try and provide a minimum allocation so that wards could each achieve something through the programme. And so that then led to the 1.86 million, Chair, that was identified. And within that, within paragraph 3.13.4, where a ward has then had an allocation, we thought leave that open then, that if members in that ward wanted to inform which of the mix of schemes they wish to prioritise, well, they can then exercise their discretion as a ward member to inform that prioritisation within the ward. So I think those are the background comments that I would make, Chair, and then I'll ask Adam to perhaps touch on the detail in terms of the consultation, resources and responses to the questions raised. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. Adam.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I think to pick up some of the detail that Councillor Robinson set out in terms of the process and the consultation, it may be helpful just to go back to that first Executive Board report of March 2018, which set out the first 12 projects which were to be taken forward and developed into more detail as part of the round one of the local centres programme. And they were drawn from an initial pool of 54 ideas that would proceed from across the city, from ward members and others, covering, I think, around 26 of the 33 wards. So there's clearly quite a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of ideas that had been floating around and should come forward through that process. I think it was recognised in that report that in order to turn that first round of 12 projects into formal schemes that could be delivered on the ground, that there was a lot of work to do, essentially turning ideas and concepts into kind of robust and kind of cost-effective schemes on the ground. That was a resource-intensive and a time-consuming process, and I think we recognised that we probably weren't going to get to round two of the programme quite in the pace that we'd anticipated at the point of time of reporting then. So I think in 2019, we undertook to work with those projects and ward members and stakeholders who were looking to bring forward projects into round two to provide some light touch support within the resources that were available across my team to help position those projects to be ready for that round two call for projects. I think two things that kind of play into that in terms of how quickly we were able to get to that position for round two. Firstly, in terms of resources, the local centres programme is one of a number of schemes and programmes across what we do in the regeneration team. So, you know, my team and my officers were committed and kind of apportioned to this programme, but they did have other work across the piece. So this wasn't just the sole focus of their work programmes. And also one of the senior officer leads who brought this programme forward for us did suffer from a long period of ill health, which unfortunately culminated in him passing away in 2020. So it was a very difficult time for the team in that respect, in terms of resourcing the programme as a whole. So the intention had been for those round two projects that we've been working with Councillor Robinson and others over the course of 2019 to bring them into round two kind of formal project development and delivery in early 2020. But of course, we know what happened in terms of the COVID-19 situation at that point as well. So we did have a very kind of strained process in terms of the resources and the timescale that we had around this. I think in terms of the different pace at which things were being brought forward, I think that's quite a natural facet of what is a very diverse programme. Of course, each local centre has unique circumstances, each set of stakeholders has their own ambitions and ideas, and there are unique challenges and situations in each case. So I think it's not unusual for things to come forward at a different pace. I think in terms of those schemes that we were developing formally under round one, there was quite significant and ongoing engagement with ward members in terms of getting them to a point of delivery. And I think just the other point that Councillor Robinson had made in terms of the detail of business engagement and contributions to the scheme, where proposals have come forward for a focus on including and improving private property in these schemes, we have sought a contribution from those private property owners, be that to buildings or to what look like public realm areas in some of these local centres, but which are actually private land. And that is entirely consistent with how we've delivered grant schemes of this nature in the city for many years. Where the schemes have been focused on public realm or public assets, then we have sought to bring forward those without necessarily having a private sector contribution. And then the final comment I'll just make in terms of some of those process details was around the housing revenue account. And I think, as Councillor Robinson recognises, that is a ring-fenced account which can only see expenditure on housing estate assets effectively. In those wards where there are significant housing HRA assets, some ward members have sought to prioritise the local centre programme focus on those parts of the estate. And that, again, that's where we've assisted ward members in bringing forward schemes and used our resource accordingly.
Okay, thank you, Adam. Angela, I don't know if you've got anything to add.
Not at this stage, thank you.
Okay, so I throw it open to questions from board members. Jonathan.
Thank you, Chair. I'm interested in the table tells us really how far advanced schemes in different wards were considered to be. I'm interested in what is the next stage from expression of interest to moving it forward, and what work was involved in moving them forward from expression of interest phase, which would have seen each scheme or each ward get an increased number, an increased figure. Martin, are you able to help with that, or Adam?
I think it's a question that Adam's probably best placed to. Councillor Taylor.
Chair, that would vary significantly according to the nature of the scheme or proposal that's being brought forward under the EOI. In some cases, it will be more balanced towards the input of a private sector stakeholder, for example, where it's proposed on, as I mentioned earlier, private sector assets or property. Where there may be a highways aspect to it, then it would require some engagement with our highways colleagues and engineering advice to work up scheme proposals. And where we've seen schemes such as other public realm, that then again, there'll be some highways kind of design input to that. It is essentially an iterative process. But I would emphasise that we've kind of focused on those round one schemes, which have been in the formal stage of working up through EOI into business cases, which can be ultimately supported and funded.
Okay, Jonathan, do you want to come back?
Yes, please, Chair. Thanks, Adam, for that. And the reason I ask is because I would consider. I mean, I signed Matt's call-in request, and I am concerned about the impact on town centres across the city, but I do have a selfish reason for doing so, is because I considered the scheme that Horsforth Ward was presenting to be far beyond expression of interest, period. I mean, the problem that we had was getting feedback from council officers. We first met or discussed this in 2019. We had on-site meetings in 2019. We really struggled to get any sort of enthusiasm for the project, even though we were pushing this with local businesses, and also had support from the expansion of Horsforth School for the car park that we wanted to focus on. So much so, and I rummaged through the disaster zone that's my second bedroom, and I found the flyer handout that we put out, and the rudimentary drawing, which Councillor Collins will forgive me for saying, of what we had to do, of what the car park would look like, it is there. And it just seems that we didn't seem to have the same support that officers are given to other schemes, and has reduced our allocation right down to the bare minimum, where we were ready to go in for planning permission, we thought, but never got any sort of feedback back from council officers to suggest that we were and now it suggests that we weren't any more advanced in the team than expression of interest, which doesn't reflect the amount of work that went into it. And I'm kind of concerned that could be reflected across the other wards that we see that have got the reduced allocation. So I'd just be interested to see what Adam's view on that is.
Adam?
Yeah, I think you're referring to the Church Lane car park proposal in Horsforth, and I think there was for quite a while some uncertainty as to how that would relate to the adjoining school expansion and the access requirements. And I think we had some fairly light touch discussions with yourselves as ward members bringing this idea forward. But again, I would emphasise that this was a scheme which wasn't in our round one. where we were focusing our efforts to bring forward schemes which had been mandated by Executive Board. And we were seeking to be helpful, but at that point we didn't have the time or the resources to commit to looking into the detail that would need to kind of clear this into a detailed scope.
Okay, thank you. I've got Councillor Ritchie and then Councillor Wadsworth. Kevin.
Thanks, Chair. Yeah, just a couple of things. Under 4.43, there's this point about not having a direct impact on the revenue account. That's on page 27, no direct revenue implications. However, there will be an impact on the revenue going forward in terms of the interest on the borrowing. I wonder if officers are able to put that amount into context to see what sort of saving that would be year on year by having this reduction. Secondly, perhaps maybe it might be Angela or Martin who might just have a few thoughts on the likely economic bounce back once the restrictions are lifted. There's positive noises being made by the Chancellor. I see already in Leeds a nightclub's opening at 12 on the 21st or the 22nd of June. So even if there was a do nothing approach, which there isn't in this programme, but some of it is continuing, just what impact we'd see going forward, do we think, on the economic sort of bounce back and recovery? And I think Councillor Hayden made a good point about how local centres have actually in some ways thrived. Obviously the supermarkets and some of the shops that have essential shops that have remained open despite the lockdown, and hopefully that will continue. And then finally, I wonder what support will be given to members in wards, because the council has quite a lot of relatively new members who might not be totally up to speed with other pots of funding that are available. So there's scope within your wellbeing budgets and capital, etc., that could be perhaps used as alternative sources of funding. So would members be supported to go down that route? And I cite a few examples in my own ward where Bramley Baths was cut, a victim of the cuts a few years ago, and we used our wellbeing funding to sort of bridge fund that before an asset transfer. I know colleagues in Armley have done that at the West Leeds Activity Centre in the past. And we've also done it with community committees, and that in the context of wards which suffer from great pressure under our wellbeing, funding lots of poverty related schemes as well, and yet we still manage to invest in those capital assets and help protect them through an asset transfer. So hopefully there'll be support for members in other wards to remind them how they can utilise some of those gains that they've had from, say, planning gain and the like. Thank you.
Thanks, Kevin. Martin, do you want to kick off and bring in Adam if necessary?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Firstly, in terms of the revenue impact, I'll caveat this comment by saying I'm not a finance officer, Councillor Ritchie, but in my discussions with Victoria Bradshaw, it depends what rate of interest on our borrowing and what cost you apply. But I think the 2.7 million of capital generates a revenue saving per annum of about 120 to 140,000 pounds per annum of that order. And I'll invite Adam or Angela to tell me I've got that wrong. If they're silent, then I think that's the best figure that's going to come forward. It is normally about 40 to 50,000 pounds per million, Councillor Ritchie. So that's how I've calculated that figure. In terms of bounce back, I mean, it is always very difficult in the context of the pandemic and the ups and downs to give forecasts. But I think, we saw this just at the weekend with the good weather, and I know that there were lots of people out and about, which is probably a pent-up impact of lockdown. I was in dialogue with Councillor Dan Cohen last night, because of some of the particular issues that caused at Roundhay. So, subject to the success of the roadmap, subject to not having further waves of infection, you can see the prospect of that recovery and town district centres being a recipient of that footfall. And as you say, Councillor Ritchie, that many of them have benefited relative to the city centre, where because of a lack of a workforce, people not wanting to go into the city centre, we see their footfall still at about 80% down from what it would normally be. And obviously that's a key area of recovery. In terms of Bramley Baths, I was deeply involved in the asset transfer of Bramley Baths, and I think that is a good example of where the community involvement in the management of that has been a real positive, in a similar way to the Leeds Gymnastics Club, which we transferred at a similar stage. And then perhaps if I just ask Adam to talk about the resources on this programme going forward, Adam, and how they can assist in terms of signposting of further funding opportunities. Perhaps if you could pick that up.
Yeah, so the resources on this programme will be, there will be a senior programme lead within the team, and myself will be looking at this as well. And we'll be refocusing the programme board as well, which Angela will be chairing from here on in. But the role of that project team and the case officers within that is to kind of see the LCP as a starting point in terms of the funding. I think it was a principle that we established from the off and still holds, that whatever the allocation there is to award or a project, it's about adding value using that. So how we do bring in alternative other funding sources, be those internal or external to the council. So absolutely, yeah, I think my officers would be looking to work with members on that basis.
Thanks, Martin and Adam. Kevin, do you want to come back?
No, that's fine, Chair. Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Wadsworth.
Thank you, Chair. It's really just a short question to Martin, really. £4.6 million was allocated, and you say always cutting a live programme is difficult. Should this still have been a live programme after all this time? Was there a set out format of how the 4.6 was going to be delivered? Because it seems to me that the capital money was allocated, but then the delivery just fell away. And I take Adam's comments about the officer falling ill and subsequently dying, and that's really unfortunate. But should possibly there have been some money top sliced to ensure that it was delivered via maybe private consultants to actually make sure that wards came forward? Because I know in my ward we were told that the funding was there, but we weren't in the first round. So we've sat quiet and been good people and not hassled. And now we're left with just 30,000 to spend. And we effectively have a shovel-ready scheme. Maybe needs a bit of costing up because it's a highway scheme, and a contractor to deliver it. But it's not a big job to do, particularly. And so I just wonder whether the 4.6 was ever worked out how it would be delivered. And so now we're left with a live programme to cut, which could have been solved by not having a live programme if these schemes have been delivered.
Martin.
Councillor, yeah, you have to forgive me, Councillor Watson, but my internet's cutting out, and I got the bulk of the question. I think, as Adam says, it always was going to be a phased programme. There will have been a phasing within the capital programme that set out how that expenditure was intended to be rolled out. I don't know whether, Adam, do you have the detail on that for Councillor Wadsworth in terms of what the phasing expectations were, which I think is partly determined by the annual resources the council wish to apply to the programme, but then also balanced against the human resources available to deliver it. Adam, can you provide any detail on that?
Yeah, I think the original intent was to see round one as a year to 18 months of project development and delivery, and then round two kind of slightly overlapping with the end of that, and probably a similar phase. And ultimately the programme being delivered in the course of maybe three and a half years. Clearly it didn't pan out that way, but I think in terms of bringing in private sector support, I think a lot of the time and the resource commitment to this is in the nuance of some of those local relationships. It's not necessarily a technical programme management issue. So I think that could have been quite an inefficient way of using the capital programme to achieve the aims.
Okay, thank you. Paul, do you want to come back?
Well, it's just on the nuance, really. I mean, could that not have been provided by elected members? They do know their areas best, and they know what people want best. And I never felt there was this engagement between elected members and the programme. It just seemed to be divorced from each other rather than engage with each other.
Martin, Adam.
Sorry, Adam. You dealt with the detailed engagement with members. Do you want to respond?
Yeah, again, I'd just draw this distinction really between the engagement with members who were in the formal round one of the process and the ongoing detailed work that we were engaged with there, and the lighter touch support that we sought to give to members and schemes coming forward in advance of a formal round two being actioned.
Okay, thank you, Adam. I can't at this point see any other members of the board indicating. Councillor Buckley.
Yes, thank you, Chair. It's just a brief question stroke comment, actually. Councillor Ritchie made a point about economic bounce back, and there obviously will be one. It stands to reason. There has to be. And Martin responded with some remarks of his own. But I just wanted to make the point that as it's now turned out with the timing of all this, this scheme could have been part of the economic bounce back, and it could have actually helped the people who need it. And you know, it's interesting that when a business has ceased to operate as it has now, and talking about bounce back, people might see in a few months' time a new shop open up where that business had been closed, or a different business open up. But this is not a victimless situation. The original business owners might be wiped out. They could be wiped out, and so they've disappeared. The premises reopen up and a business restarts, but there are people, there are victims in this. It's not as optimistic as you might think.
Okay, I think we'll take that as a comment, but a point well worth making. If there are no other members indicating either virtually or physically on screen, then we'll come to the summing up section. And Councillor Hayden, you go first in terms of the summing up to the board based on the discussions that have taken place.
Thank you, Chair. It's a really interesting discussion, and I think it just brings into relief the situation that we're in and what we're facing going forward. And we just haven't, after the last year, we haven't the money, have we, that we would have wanted to put in. And we do want businesses to bounce back. We do want businesses to survive. They're at the very heart of our communities. So I think we need to look at the situation we're in, look at where we need to go forward, and with good consultation with ward members who do know their communities well and speak regularly to their communities, then we can see the best use of this money to give our local centres that thriving feel and dynamic that they richly deserve. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Matthew.
Thanks, Chair. And I've listened to what officers have had to say there, and there are two reflections. The first is that you've heard about this split between round one and round two, or the subsequent rounds. And I think that goes to some of the crux of the matter here, that if you were in round one, your scheme got delivered and it happened. If you were in round two, you got this light touch support, and light touch was mentioned, and a nuance in relationships. So your scheme was left longer and you've now had the cut, is what it comes down to. Whatever the merits of your scheme may have been, there has been a cut there to them. Differential levels of cut, I accept from exactly what officers have said, but that's been there. The second part to this is about engagement as well. It's been asked, what do I want? Well, I think what I want is simple. I want an improved local centres programme, one that better works with members, one that better works with businesses, one that better communicates with members and communities, one that looks at a package of funding for the future, where schemes have lost out or where there's new opportunities that come from schemes. One that looks at what has been delivered and what is being delivered and seeks to bring those schemes forward and share best practice. And one that advertises our local centres to improve that idea of shopping local. I don't agree with the idea that local centres may have thrived and so we don't need to support them, and it's actually more support that they need now more than ever to quicken the bounce back, and a commitment that, given what's happened here with funding, that this is not going to be gutted again in 21-22, because I think there is a real risk that members may come from here, seek to try and progress schemes, and this budget comes under scrutiny again and comes under threat again, and that really would kill off local centres and the local centres programme forever and a day. So I hope that the calling will be considered in that vein. I have tried to, despite the item on the agenda, Chair, I have tried to steer away from a budgetary discussion and to steer away from when they're talking about debt and things like that. I know if we want to have that discussion, I'll have it all day long, but I've tried to steer away and keep it to the point there. So I'll pause there. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Now we move on to the vote. I'm going to go through the board membership alphabetically. And in terms of your vote, what I want to hear is whether you agree to the release of the decision or to refer the decision back. So if you can just say release or refer back. Okay, Councillor Neil Buckley.
Refer back, Chair.
Councillor Cunningham.
Release.
Councillor Dawson.
Thank you, Chair. I'd just like to, before I make my vote, I'd just like to say how I got there. I think this is
no, Councillor Dawson. Councillor Dawson.
Yeah.
No, it's just the vote at this point.
All right then. Thank you, Chair. I'll go for option 1, which is release for implementation.
Thank you. Councillor Hussain.
Yeah, release, Chair.
Councillor Lennox.
Release the decision, Chair.
Councillor Renshaw. Sorry, Karen, we didn't hear you.
Please, Chair.
Thank you.
That's why.
Councillor Ritchie.
Release, Chair, thank you.
Councillor Shazad.
Release, Chair, thank you.
Councillor Taylor.
Refer, please, Chair.
My vote is to release as Chair, and Councillor Wadsworth.
Last but not least, refer back.
I think it's very clear that the board has voted by a majority to release the decision for implementation. So that really brings the meeting to a close, but can I reiterate my thanks to everyone for participating, especially those substitutes who came in at very short notice. It is highly valued, and thank you for your contribution. So stay safe, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.